Hello, all you kings, queens, and those in between, and welcome to another meeting of Paresh's Book Club, where I get to puke up all my thoughts about whatever book I manage to clear out of my backlog. Of all the things in my life that I'm glad I stopped taking seriously, originality is definitely one of them. Roger Ebert had this saying where he didn't care what a movie was about, only how it was about it. But I think Guillermo del Toro puts it better in a tweet where he said, telling a story is the desire to create worlds that exist solely within us for the solace of others that may need them. And how appropriate it is that I bring up Guillermo del Toro for this episode, because today's book is the first result if you Google the phrase Pacific Rim meets The Handmaid's Tale. Xiran Zhao's Iron Widow. While this book wears its influences on its forehead, it isn't the only reason I went on my little originality spiel at the beginning. The pull quote on the cover calls it a primal scream of a book, and that is such a spot-on description that this whole episode is just going to be me piggybacking off of that one statement. Also, apologies in advance if I mispronounce any character or location names. I've only read them, and now I'm debating whether I should start investing in audiobooks. Iron Widow takes place in a futuristic world inspired by real-world history, where pilots control these giant mechs called chrysalises to fight and protect the land of Huaja against giant insect-like creatures called hunduns. The problem is how these chrysalises are piloted. They come equipped with two seats, one for a male pilot who steers and fights, and one for a female concubine who serves as an energy source. And if the fight gets too desperate and the mech has to reach its final form, the energy drain is enough to kill the concubine, which is labeled as a noble sacrifice, of course. One of those ill-fated concubines just so happened to be the sister of our protagonist, Zishan who has made it her mission to not only get revenge on the male pilot responsible for her sister's death, but to overturn the entire system that allows the Chrysalis program to exist. I'd read this book after finishing last night at the Telegraph Club, and if Telegraph Club was a gentle caress on the cheek, Iron Widow is a punch to the throat. The tonal whiplash was no joke. In case it wasn't obvious from my plot synopsis, this book is not subtle. At all. However, what you probably couldn't glean from the synopsis is how breakneck the pace is. That part I mentioned about Zishan's sister dying because of the fucked up Chrysalis program is only the prologue. Everything after that is 400 pages of Zishan carving a path full of death and destruction, but mostly death, fueled by angst and spite. But, as with anything fast-paced, there's not a lot of focus on minute details of the world. Like, there's a type advantage system based on the chi of both the pilots and the hunduns that's relegated to a chart at the beginning, with brief reminders in the text. But honestly, that's not a fatal flaw. There are times for detailed lore dumps, like in These Violent Delights, but that's another episode. Here, Zhao clearly had ideas that they wanted to get out into the world, and goddamn, they did not hold back. Which brings me back to my point about originality. I mentioned how open this book is about its influences, and that includes the historical events surrounding China's first female emperor. So if you're familiar with that point in history, you've got an idea of where this story is going to go, and to Zhao's credit, they flat out tell you at the beginning to please rely on non-fiction sources for an accurate picture of it. But even if you're like me, and the only historical reference that doesn't go over your head is the one about Journey to the West, this is still a pretty standard YA book with giant robots fighting giant bug-like creatures, with a little dash of Hunger Games style behind-the-scenes shenanigans and the hard-to-miss social commentary that essentially boils down to, I am woman, hear me roar. We've seen these tropes before. Here's the thing, though. Not only does this not matter, but in this instance, it's a good thing. Iron Widow's influences allow us to fill in the blanks of the world and lore that aren't otherwise spelled out. Plus, it ends on one hell of a cliffhanger, and given how strong sales have been, a sequel should be on its way. This lets us focus on the part of the story that we haven't seen very often. The story of this angry, disabled 18-year-old seeking vengeance with no regard to how it looks to an outsider. In other words, it's the story that exists solely within Xiran Zhao, for the solace of others that may need it. Now, I know that there are people who will criticize Iron Widow for being too fast-paced or for Zishan's methods for being too extreme. And to both of those sentiments, I offer the same rebuttal. Fuck you. They're efficient.